Hello there, and welcome back. Tonight we're going to step far back in time, into a world both familiar and utterly alien. Imagine a planet wrapped in cold, where vast sheets of ice stretched across continents, where towering animals wandered through frozen grasslands, and where our own ancestors huddled close to fires, carving tools and stories into bone and stone. This is the Ice Age. Not a single moment, but an era lasting for millions of years, shaping the Earth we know today in ways we're still uncovering. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Maybe you're listening late at night, with the quiet hum of the world around you. Maybe you're just curious, searching for a calm place to drift while you learn. Either way, let's make this a slow journey, one where you don't need to rush or keep track of the clock. Because while the Ice Age was cold, it moved at a pace so gradual that entire lifetimes passed without anyone noticing the world was changing. The first thing to understand is that the Ice Age wasn't just one long freeze. It was a cycle, a rhythm of cold glacial periods and warmer intervals in between, called interglacials. Earth's climate shifted back and forth over tens of thousands of years, driven by subtle changes in the planet's orbit, its tilt, and even the way it wobbled like a spinning top. These changes in sunlight reshaped the world so completely that oceans receded, land bridges rose, and entire ecosystems came and went like tides on a much larger scale. But let's not start with the science just yet. Picture instead the world itself. You're standing on what will one day be Northern Europe or North America or Siberia. The horizon is not filled with cities or forests. Instead, there's a wall of ice, hundreds of meters high, stretching farther than the eye can see. The air is sharp, dry, and heavy with the scent of snow. And yet, despite the cold, the landscape isn't lifeless. Out on the frozen plains roam herds of woolly mammoths, their curved tusks glinting faintly in the pale light. Giant ground sloths lumber across the land in the Americas, while saber-toothed cats crouch low in the grass, their muscles coiled, their long teeth catching the light like polished ivory. Farther south, where the ice never reached, there are still forests and rivers, and in those warmer pockets, humans are finding ways to survive. They follow the herds, hunt with spears tipped in stone, and gather around fires to share the little warmth the world allows. They don't know they live in what we now call the Ice Age. For them, it's just life. And this is the strange thing about the deep past. It wasn't a frozen wasteland from pole to pole. While the northern continents were locked under ice, the equator was still warm enough for jungles and deserts to exist. Life adapted. It moved. It endured. The Earth during the Ice Age was not only colder, it was wilder, sharper, and full of contrasts. The story begins long before humans entered the picture. For millions of years, our planet has shifted between cold and warm periods, each one leaving marks in stone and soil. Scientists have pieced this together from clues hidden in ice cores drilled deep into Antarctica and Greenland. Layer by layer, these cores trap tiny bubbles of ancient air, giving us a record of what the atmosphere was like hundreds of thousands of years ago. From them, we know that the Ice Age didn't arrive all at once. It crept forward, glaciers advancing slowly, then retreating, then advancing again, like a tide grinding rock into dust. As the ice grew, it reshaped the land beneath it. Mountains were carved into jagged peaks. Valleys deepened. Enormous boulders were pushed across the landscape like pebbles, left behind when the glaciers finally pulled back. Even now, if you walk through parts of Canada, Scandinavia, or the northern United States, you can still see these marks, lakes scoured out by moving ice, U-shaped valleys that tell of glaciers long gone, and rocks carried hundreds of kilometres from where they first formed. But it wasn't only the land that changed. The oceans dropped by more than 100 metres as water became locked up in the ice sheets. Entire continents grew larger. Asia and North America were joined by a land bridge we now call Beringia, a frozen highway across what is now the Bering Strait. This bridge didn't just shape geography, it shaped history. It allowed humans and animals to migrate between continents, spreading life across the globe in ways that would echo for thousands of years. Imagine standing on that bridge. The wind cuts across the open tundra, carrying snow that never quite settles. Herds of caribou and mammoth move in steady lines, grazing on the sparse, dry grass that somehow survives here. Wolves stalk them at a distance, their fur thick against the cold. And following it all, small groups of humans trudge forward, wrapped in furs, their breath curling in the air. Every step they take brings them closer to a new world. What's remarkable is how interconnected everything was. When the ice grew, the Earth dried out because so much of the planet's water was locked away in the glaciers. Deserts expanded, and the great tropical forests shrank. Where once there had been endless green, now there were open plains stretching for miles. This vast steppe environment, the Mammoth Steppe as scientists sometimes call it, covered much of Europe, Asia and North America. It was harsh, but it was rich in life, home to vast herds of grazing animals that could support both predators and the first human hunters brave enough to follow them. Yet for all its scale and severity, the Ice Age wasn't unchanging. Every few tens of thousands of years, the ice retreated, temperatures rose, and the planet greened again. Rivers swelled, forests returned, and the great grasslands shrank. These warmer periods didn't last forever. Inevitably, the glaciers crept forward once more, slow but relentless, until the world froze again. It was during one of these warmer intervals that humans began to flourish, learning to shape stone into blades, to paint their lives onto cave walls, and eventually to step out of the Ice Age world entirely and into what we now call history. Even so, the fingerprints of that frozen era never disappeared. We see it not only in the land but in ourselves. Our migrations, our myths, even our bodies still carry traces of that time. And to truly understand the Earth we live on now, we have to walk back into that frozen world, to watch the ice move and the great animals roam, and to remember that the world has been many things before it became this one. And so, let's keep walking into the cold. The wind is rising and the horizon is white with snow, but there's more to see. Because this is only the beginning, and the Ice Age has much more to show us. The cold did not come suddenly. It crept across the Earth in slow, quiet waves, so gradual that no single lifetime could have felt the change. But over thousands of years, the transformation was unstoppable. It began with small shifts in the planet's orbit, tilts and wobbles so slight they would seem meaningless to anyone standing on the ground. Yet these subtle motions changed how much sunlight reached the northern parts of the world, and little by little, summers became cooler. Snow that once melted each year began to linger, and over time that lingering snow hardened into ice. It is almost impossible to imagine how different the world looked before that transformation began. Much of the northern continents were green, covered in forests and open plains. Rivers ran freely, and animals grazed across lands that today we know only as frozen tundra. But as the centuries passed, and each summer failed to erase the snows of the previous winter, a slow accumulation began, layer after layer, year after year, until the snow packed down under its own weight and became ice. From those beginnings, the first glaciers grew, and once they started to move, nothing could stop them. The great ice sheets did not simply appear, they advanced like armies, inch by inch. At their peak, these glaciers were so massive they buried entire landscapes, swallowing mountains and valleys alike. The Laurentide ice sheet stretched across much of North America, blanketing Canada and reaching deep into what is now the United States. In Europe, the Fennoscandian ice sheet covered Scandinavia and pushed southward, reshaping the land with its crushing weight. In the southern hemisphere, even the highlands of South America and New Zealand bore their own icy crowns. The air itself changed as the world cooled. When so much water was locked up in ice, the oceans fell, exposing wide stretches of land that had once been hidden beneath the waves. Winds scoured the open plains, carrying dust for hundreds of miles, settling it in thick layers that still lie buried beneath the soil in parts of China and the American Midwest. In these dry, windy conditions, forests withered, grasslands spread, an entire ecosystem shifted southward in search of warmth. But Earth is not a simple machine. Its climate has always been the result of many forces working together, and while orbital changes began the process, they weren't alone in shaping the Ice Age. Volcanic eruptions sent ash and gas into the sky, dimming the sunlight and cooling the atmosphere even further. The oceans, too, played their part, as currents shifted and locked more heat into the deep. Over time, this feedback loop of cooling built upon itself until the planet settled into a state very different from the one we know today. Yet even in this frozen world, life endured. Plants adapted to the cold, spreading across the edges of the glaciers, while hardy grasses colonized the vast steppes. Animals followed. Woolly mammoths and mastodons, their heavy coats and thick fat suited to the bitter winds, roamed in enormous herds. Bison, musk oxen and reindeer ranged across the open plains, grazing endlessly on the dry tundra. Predators thrived as well. Saber-toothed cats lurked in the shadows of the grasslands, while packs of dire wolves tracked the herds across the snow. And beyond the great animals there were the smaller survivors, foxes darting between drifts of snow, birds migrating along ancient routes, rodents tunnelling into the frozen earth. Every living thing carved out its niche, shaped by a world where the rules of survival were harsh but constant. Humans entered this stage much later, but even before their arrival, the Ice Age had already written its mark into the land. As glaciers expanded, they scraped deep grooves into the earth, crushing rock and grinding it into fine powder. When the ice retreated, it left behind a landscape that was raw and new, dotted with lakes and rivers formed from the meltwater. In some places, it left behind enormous piles of stone and gravel, the ruins of its long, slow advance. These were not just changes to the scenery, they were the foundations of the world we walk on now. In many ways, this period was both violent and quiet. Glaciers moved with relentless force, but their progress was almost invisible on the scale of a single human life. Mountains bowed under their weight, yet an animal could live its entire existence in the shadow of that ice without seeing it move an inch. That is the scale of deep time, where the drama of the earth unfolds in increments too slow for any one pair of eyes to see, and yet leaves marks that last for millions of years. If you could have stood on the edge of one of those early glaciers, you would have felt it. Not in the way you feel a storm or a sudden gust of wind, but in the quiet heaviness of the air, the faint groan of shifting ice, and the endless stillness of a frozen horizon. The sky would be pale and dry, the sun low, the land silent except for the distant crack of the ice as it crept forward. But this was only the beginning. Over time the cold deepened, the glaciers grew larger, and the world entered one of the most dramatic periods in its history. Yet this frozen planet was not dead. It was changing, shaping the land, the seas, and eventually the fate of the humans who would learn to survive within it. And so the stage was set. A planet wrapped in ice, a landscape carved by forces too vast to see, and a world where survival would mean adaptation in ways no creature had ever faced before. From this frozen stage, the story of the Ice Age would truly begin, one slow step at a time. When the ice ruled the earth, it wasn't only the land that seemed immense. The creatures that walked upon it were unlike anything alive today. This was an age of giants, shaped by a world both unforgiving and vast, where size itself was a survival strategy. To stand in that world would have been to feel small, no matter who or what you were. The great herds came first. Imagine an endless plain, cold and wind-scoured, but alive with movement. Woolly mammoths marched in long lines, their shaggy coats swaying like curtains of coarse hair. their curved tusks sweeping the air as they dug through the snow for grass. These were not rare, solitary beasts. They gathered in groups by the dozens, sometimes hundreds, moving across the steppe in search of food. Their footprints pressed deep into the frozen ground, carving paths that stretched for miles. Alongside them roamed the mastodons, stockier cousins of the mammoths, their shorter legs and straighter tusks suited for the mixed forest that clung to the edges of the glacial plains. They tore at branches and bark with steady determination, stripping the land bare as they moved from one patch of sheltering trees to the next. But the mammoths and mastodons were only part of this frozen parade. The grasslands themselves were alive with bison, their heavy shoulders and thick fur shields against the cutting wind. Musk oxen, low and broad, clustered in tight defensive circles when predators drew near. Reindeer, ancestors of the caribou, migrated endlessly, their hooves striking the hard ground in a rhythm as old as the glaciers themselves. Predators followed. Dire wolves prowled the edges of the herds, larger and stronger than their modern descendants, their teeth built for crushing bone. Saber-toothed cats, with their long curved fangs, lay in wait among the sparse shrubs, ready to bring down prey many times their size. Even the cave lions, leaner but nearly twice the weight of today's lions, ranged across the steppes, hunting in coordinated groups that could challenge even the most formidable prey. And towering over this already harsh and dramatic world were the glaciers themselves. These titanic rivers of ice loomed in the distance like frozen walls, their sheer faces fractured with deep blue crevasses. They moved slowly, but their presence was impossible to ignore. The air near them carried a chill that cut straight through the thickest fur. Each crack of shifting ice echoed for miles, a deep sound that reminded every living thing of the power lying just beyond reach. Yet for all their dominance, the glaciers were not static. They advanced and retreated, grinding across the continents, scouring away the soil and reshaping the world beneath. Where they passed, they left behind bare stone, scraped clean by their slow and merciless weight. They carved valleys that later filled with rivers and lakes. They created cliffs and ridges that shaped the migration paths of animals, forcing them into new lands and in doing so, creating new opportunities for the predators that hunted them. In the shadow of those glaciers, life persisted. It adapted in ways that seem almost impossible today. Many of the great Ice Age animals carried thick layers of fat beneath their hides, insulation against the bitter cold. Their coats were dense, not just fur, but underlayers of wool so fine that it trapped heat close to the skin. Even their blood was different. Some species evolved the ability to circulate warmth more efficiently, keeping their limbs from freezing even in the harshest winds. Humans, too, learned to live alongside these giants. For our ancestors, the presence of mammoths was not only a danger, but a lifeline. From their bones came shelter. From their hides came clothing. From their meat came the calories that allowed small bands of hunters to survive in a world where food could be scarce and the nights were long and bitter. And still, the scale of the Ice Age world could dwarf any one life. A single glacier could stretch for hundreds of miles. A herd of mammoths could take days to pass from one horizon to the other. Even the sky seemed larger, its pale light reflected off snow and ice in every direction. This was not a world made for comfort. It was a world that demanded endurance, and in return it forged creatures, both human and animal, into survivors of extraordinary resilience. To stand there, on that cold and windswept land, would have been to see the earth in one of its rawest forms, the air sharp enough to sting, the sound of distant glaciers shifting like the groan of an ancient beast, the sight of animals larger than houses moving in slow, deliberate lines across the horizon. Every part of it spoke of a planet reshaped by forces far beyond any single creature's control, and yet there was balance in it. The glaciers advanced, but they also retreated. The giants thrived, but they also fell to hunters, or vanished into the snow when food grew scarce. Life persisted not because it conquered the cold, but because it learned to live within it. As the world moved through these frozen millennia, this balance would be tested again and again. The climate shifted, ice gave way to warmth, then returned. Animals migrated, adapted, or disappeared, and somewhere in the midst of it, humans kept learning, watching, and following the slow dance of the earth and its icebound giants. Now, as we move further into this frozen past, the focus turns to the engine that drove it all, the strange, intricate changes in the planet's climate, and how they set every one of these events into motion. The cold was never steady. Even at the height of the Ice Age, the Earth was not locked in one unchanging freeze. It breathed. Over tens of thousands of years, the temperature rose and fell like a slow tide, and with each shift, the glaciers advanced or retreated, reshaping the land and the lives that depended on it. To understand this world, it isn't enough to picture a planet buried in snow. We have to see how that snow moved, how the cold deepened and then eased, and how these long, quiet changes wrote the story of the Ice Age. At the heart of this rhythm were cycles we can still trace today. Scientists call them Milankovitch cycles, after the mathematician who first calculated their patterns. They are driven by the way the Earth moves around the Sun, not in a perfect circle, but in a long, slow dance that changes over tens of thousands of years. The shape of our orbit stretches and relaxes. The tilt of the Earth's axis leans a little more, then a little less. Even the planet's gentle wobble, like a spinning top losing speed, shifts the way sunlight reaches different parts of the world. Each of these movements happens too slowly for any single generation to notice, but together they change everything. When the tilt is smaller, summers in the northern hemisphere are cooler. Snow that falls in winter lingers longer into the next year, and the ice grows. When the tilt increases, the summers grow warmer and stronger, melting more snow, and the ice retreats. It is a balance, subtle and relentless, turning the planet from cold to less cold and back again across vast stretches of time. Yet these orbital changes alone cannot explain the full force of the Ice Age. The Earth's climate is a web of feedbacks, where one small shift triggers another. When glaciers expand, they reflect more sunlight into space, which cools the planet even further. The colder it gets, the more the oceans draw down carbon dioxide, locking it away and lowering greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That drop in carbon dioxide cools the world even more, helping the ice spread farther. It is a chain reaction that takes millennia to build, and even longer to reverse. But the cycle works both ways. When the Earth begins to warm, the opposite happens. Ice melts, exposing dark land and open water, which absorb more heat. The oceans release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, trapping more warmth. The feedback loop reverses and the glaciers retreat. The planet does not simply fall into an ice age or escape from it. It moves back and forth between these states like a pendulum, steady in its swing but immense in its scale. Even within these grand cycles there were smaller jolts, sudden pulses of cold or warmth that rippled across the Ice Age world. Some came from the oceans, as vast currents shifted their paths, redistributing heat between the equator and the poles. Others were triggered by massive volcanic eruptions, sending ash and sulphur into the sky and dimming the sun for years at a time. And at the edges of the great ice sheets, immense lakes sometimes formed behind walls of frozen water. When those icy barriers collapsed, they unleashed floods so vast that they rewrote coastlines, and may have shifted the climate for centuries. To live through these changes was to see the world tilt slowly out of balance, and then settle again. For the animals that roamed the steppe and the forests, it meant following the land as it changed. Herds of mammoth and bison would push south when the cold bit deep, only to spread north again when the ice withdrew. Predators followed their prey. Early humans, small bands of hunters and gatherers, learned to read these patterns in the land, moving with the seasons and the shifting borders of the cold. The glaciers themselves recorded these swings in silent detail. Every layer of ice holds tiny bubbles of ancient air, trapped as snow fell and pressed down year after year. When scientists drill deep into those layers, they can see the planet breathing. They find the fingerprints of every advance and retreat, every sharp drop or sudden rise in temperature. In that frozen archive, the history of the Ice Age is still waiting, stacked one winter atop another, a library of deep time. It is one thing to read about this rhythm and another to imagine it. Picture standing on a wide cold plain, the sky pale and the wind sharp. Far to the north, a wall of ice looms like a mountain range. For centuries, it has been creeping forward, mile by mile, a slow invasion no one alive can see. Then, after thousands of years, the air warms, the summers lengthen, the edge of the glacier begins to pull back. Water streams from beneath it, carving new rivers. The land once buried in ice lies bare, raw, and open to the sun for the first time in ages. And then, in time, the cold returns, and the long march of the ice begins again. This was the breath of the Ice Age, slow, steady and powerful enough to shape continents. It was not a single freeze or a single thaw, but a vast and patient cycle, one that pushed life to its limits and then pulled it back again. In that long back and forth, animals evolved, humans adapted, and the Earth became the world we still recognise, even though so much of it has vanished beneath the warmth of the present day. Yet the story of the Ice Age is not only about cold and warmth. It is about the living world that took shape in that frozen light. Because while the climate set the stage, it was life itself, strange, massive and resilient, that gave the Ice Age its character. Beneath the endless cold and the sweeping plains of ice, life endured. It didn't merely wait for the warmth to return. It adapted, evolved, and carved out a place for itself in one of the harshest environments the Earth has ever known. To survive in the chill was not simply a matter of endurance. It required transformation, from the smallest insect hiding beneath the snow to the largest beasts roaming the frozen steppe. The ground during the Ice Age was not lifeless. Just beneath the snow lay a hidden world, one built in miniature. In the tundra soils, rodents dug networks of burrows, their tiny bodies shielded by layers of earth and frost. Lemmings, voles, and other small mammals were the base of the food chain, their survival making possible the lives of countless predators above. These creatures did not hibernate entirely. Many stayed active beneath the snowpack, their movements carving tunnels invisible from the surface. Down there the air was still, temperature stable, and the snow overhead acted as insulation against the worst of the wind. Above them, the larger animals moved across the landscape with heavy, deliberate steps. The woolly mammoths, wrapped in coats of long, coarse hair, with a dense underlayer of insulating wool, could withstand temperatures that would freeze exposed skin in minutes. Their blood carried special adaptations, allowing it to release oxygen even in the coldest parts of their bodies, keeping their limbs from stiffening. Musk oxen carried thick pelts so effective that snow could settle on their backs without melting, a sign that almost no heat escaped. Predators were no less prepared. The dire wolves and saber-toothed cats were built for strength and stamina, with powerful muscles to bring down prey in deep snow. Their coats were thick, and their paws broad enough to keep them from sinking into the frozen ground as they stalked their quarry. Even the great cave lions, some of the largest cats the world has ever seen, were shaped by the cold, leaner than their modern relatives but with limbs built for the endless pursuit of Ice Age prey across open ground. The plants that fed this frozen world were equally remarkable. At first glance, the Ice Age landscape might seem barren, but just beneath the snow and in the brief summers, hardy vegetation flourished. Grasses dominated the mammoth steppe, covering vast areas from Europe to North America. These grasses were rich in nutrients, perfectly suited for grazing herds that needed to eat nearly constantly to survive the cold. Mixed among them were tough shrubs and dwarf willows, their branches hugging close to the ground, safe from the relentless wind. These plants had evolved to withstand long periods of darkness and brief, but intense seasons of growth, responding quickly to the short window of summer sunlight. Even insects found a way to endure. Some produced natural antifreeze within their bodies, proteins that kept their cells from freezing solid. Others laid eggs that could survive the winter untouched, waiting for the brief warmth of summer to awaken the next generation. Birds adapted too. Many species migrated south, but some stayed, their feathers dense, their metabolisms burning hot enough to endure the deep cold. The snowy owl, for example, patrolled the tundra year-round, feeding on lemmings and thriving in a world that few others could tolerate. Humans, though fragile by comparison, were not without their own strategies. Early hunters and gatherers relied on ingenuity as much as strength. They fashioned clothing from furs, stitched tightly to trap heat. They built shelters from bone and hide, using mammoth ribs as frames for tents covered in thick layers of animal skin. Fire was their greatest ally, not only for warmth, but for survival itself, allowing them to cook food, harden tools, and push back against the deep, unrelenting dark. For these small bands of people, life was a constant negotiation with the cold. Every step into the snow carried risk. Frostbite, hunger, and predators were a daily threat. Yet they learned to move with the seasons, following the herds as they migrated, using rivers and coastlines as landmarks across the endless white. They made weapons from stone and bone, sharp enough to pierce the thick hides of the beasts they hunted, and over time their knowledge of this frozen world deepened until they could live not in spite of the cold, but because they understood it. What made this hidden web of life remarkable was its balance. The snow did not simply bury the world, it shaped it. Beneath its weight, species learned to bend without breaking. Each adaptation, from the smallest vole's tunnel to the mammoth's insulating coat, was a response to an environment that demanded everything and gave little in return. But this world was not only about survival, it was also about transformation. With every swing of the climate, with every advance or retreat of the glaciers, life shifted. Species that thrived in the cold sometimes vanished when the world warmed. Others emerged, stepping into the niches left behind. The Ice Age was not a frozen prison. It was a crucible, and from it came creatures and behaviours that still echo in the living world today. Even now, in the tundras of Siberia or the Arctic Circle, you can see fragments of that ancient survival strategy. The muskox still stands broad and immovable against the wind. Arctic foxes still change their coats from brown to white with the seasons, vanishing into the snow like ghosts. These living remnants are reminders that the Ice Age did not end cleanly. It left pieces of itself scattered across the earth, pieces that still endure, and as the glaciers breathed in and out, as the cold deepened and eased, this hidden world beneath the snow never stopped changing. What lay ahead was a planet still in motion, one where ice would carve the land in ways that reshaped the very bones of the earth. The ice was never still. It moved with a force so vast and unrelenting that it reshaped entire continents. When we imagine glaciers, we often picture silent walls of frozen white, but these great ice sheets were not static monuments. They were engines of change, grinding, crushing, and carving the land beneath them with a patience only the earth itself can keep. The largest of them blanketed much of the northern world. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet stretched from the high Arctic down to what is now the middle of the United States. It was so thick in places that its surface rose higher than the tallest mountains. Across the Atlantic, the Fennoscandian ice sheet covered Scandinavia and pushed deep into northern Europe, its edge slowly grinding forward like a tide of frozen stone. Even in the southern hemisphere, smaller ice sheets covered the highlands of South America and New Zealand, and parts of Antarctica that reached farther than they do today. These sheets of ice were not gentle. As they advanced, they scraped the earth bare. They tore away forests, crushed hills, and ground rock into fine powder. Beneath their weight, the crust of the planet itself bent downward, sinking slightly under the load. When the ice later retreated, the land rose again, a slow rebound that continues even now in parts of Canada and Scandinavia. The movement of the ice left behind landscapes that are still easy to recognise. Deep valleys with flat bottoms and steep walls, carved by the relentless pressure of moving glaciers, can be found across the northern world. Great boulders, carried for hundreds of miles and dropped far from their source, sit scattered across open fields, silent witnesses to the journeys they once made trapped in the ice. And then there are the lakes, thousands of them, filling the basins gouged out by glaciers. The Great Lakes of North America are perhaps the most famous example. Vast bodies of water resting in the scars left by the retreating Laurentide ice sheet. The glaciers were not merely sculptors of land. They also shaped the waters of the world. As the ice grew, sea levels dropped, exposing vast coastal plains. When the ice melted, the seas rose again, drowning those same plains beneath the waves. The land bridges that once connected continents, like the one that linked Asia to North America, existed only because so much of the planet's water was locked up in ice. Each shift of the glaciers rewrote the map of the Earth. Yet for all their power, the glaciers moved slowly. A few feet a day was all it took for their weight to change the face of a continent. To stand before one was to look at a force that felt eternal, even though it was always in motion. You could hear it sometimes, the sharp cracks of shifting ice, the low groan of frozen mass pressing against the land. When meltwater pooled and then broke free, it surged across the earth in floods so massive they carved new channels in a matter of days. These were not gentle rivers. They tore at the land with a strength born of centuries of trapped water suddenly unleashed. And in their wake, they left behind something unexpected. For all their destruction, glaciers also created new opportunities for life. When they retreated, they revealed fresh ground, stripped clean and rich with mineral dust. Plants were quick to colonize these bare landscapes, sending roots into the raw earth. In time, animals followed, and in their footsteps came the first human hunters, tracking the herds into the lands the glaciers had uncovered. These frozen sculptors also carried stories in their layers. Within the ice itself, scientists have found traces of ancient air, ash from distant volcanic eruptions, and even pollen from plants that grew long ago. Each layer is a record, a page in the frozen history of the Earth, telling us not only how the ice shaped the land, but how it breathed in rhythm with the climate. To the creatures that lived through it, though, the glaciers were not history. They were boundaries, massive and unmoving. To a mammoth or a bison, a glacier's edge was the end of the world, a wall that could not be crossed. Even humans, clever and determined, could only move along its borders, following rivers and valleys where the ice had not yet claimed the ground. And as the ice sheets grew and shrank with the slow pulse of the planet, they drew the map of the world we know now. Every rolling hill in northern Europe, every scattered lake across Canada, every stretch of rich soil in the American Midwest, all of it bears the mark of the glaciers. These were not just masses of frozen water. They were the chisels that carved the earth itself. But as they carved, they also changed the seas. When so much water was locked away in their frozen weight, the oceans fell. The coastlines stretched outward, and new lands emerged from beneath the waves. And it was in those newly exposed places that life, animal, human, and otherwise, would find unexpected paths forward. When the great ice sheet swelled and locked up so much of the planet's water, the oceans drew back like a tide that would not return for thousands of years. Shorelines stretched outward, exposing vast plains that had been hidden beneath the waves for ages. Rivers carved new paths across this uncovered ground, and entire continents gained new edges. The world looked different then, familiar in its shape but altered in ways that seem almost impossible to imagine now. At the height of the Ice Age, sea level dropped by more than 100 metres. This was not a sudden plunge, but a slow withdrawal, paced by the relentless growth of the glaciers. What had once been shallow coastal waters became wind-swept grasslands. Bays and inlets turned to dry valleys. Islands connected to mainlands, and land bridges appeared between continents that today are divided by open sea. The most famous of these was Beringia, the stretch of land that once connected Asia and North America. It was no narrow strip, but an enormous expanse of tundra and steppe, hundreds of miles wide, dotted with rivers and home to mammoths, bison, and the first humans who would one day cross into a new world. To those who walked it, it wasn't a bridge at all. It was a landscape, a country of its own, rich with life and as real as any other part of the earth. Farther south, the Sunda Shelf joined the islands of Southeast Asia to the mainland, creating a vast continuous landmass. Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania merged into a single connected continent. Across Europe, the North Sea floor was exposed, forming a region known today as Doggerland, a broad plain that stretched between Britain and the rest of the continent, crisscrossed by rivers and dotted with low hills. These new lands didn't just change geography, they changed the course of life itself. Animals followed the expanding frontiers, migrating into places where the sea had once barred their way. Humans did the same, tracking game across these new pathways, slowly spreading across the globe in ways that would shape the future of our species. But this transformation was not limited to land alone. The retreat of the oceans reshaped the coast that remained. Beaches stretched outward for miles, estuaries shrank, and coral reefs were left high and dry, bleaching and dying as the water abandoned them. The world's oceans grew colder and saltier, their currents shifting in response to the changing balance of water and ice. These changes, in turn, fed back into the climate, helping to hold the Earth in its frozen state. Even the air above the seas changed. As the oceans drew back, vast stretches of exposed continental shelf became sources of dust, swept up by strong ice age winds and carried for thousands of miles. This dust settled over the land, creating the thick, fertile layers that would later nourish some of the richest farmlands on Earth. It was another reminder that the Ice Age was not only an age of loss, but an age of preparation, laying the groundwork for the world that would come after the thaw. For those who lived through it, though, these changes would not have been obvious. The sea did not vanish overnight. A hunter could walk the same path his parents had walked, never realizing that far to the east or west the tide was creeping away year after year. It was only in the scale of generations that the transformation revealed itself. Rivers flowing where there had once been bays, herds grazing on ground that had been ocean floor, and new horizons opening to the daring few who followed them. And while the ocean stood still, life adapted. Coasts became hunting grounds. River mouths turned into rich feeding places for migrating birds and fish. Humans learned to use these changes to their advantage, following the trails of the animals that now roamed across these exposed plains. In every corner of the Ice Age world, the receding waters revealed not just land but opportunity. Yet, like the glaciers themselves, the oceans would not remain fixed forever. As the climate warmed, the ice would begin to retreat, and the seas would creep back in, drowning the lands they had left bare. Doggerland would sink beneath the North Sea, Beringia would vanish beneath the waters of the Bering Strait, and the coastlines of the world would draw back to something closer to the shape we know today. But that part of the story was still far off. For now, in the heart of the Ice Age, the oceans had paused. The planet stood in its frozen state, locked in a balance of ice and sea that held the world steady for thousands upon thousands of years. It was in this frozen balance that the great winds began to rise and carry their burden of dust across the sky, marking the next great force that shaped this ancient world. The cold alone did not define the Ice Age. Alongside the glaciers and the low seas came a sky heavy with dust and winds that never seemed to rest. The atmosphere during this time was not the clear, crisp air we might imagine when we picture a frozen world. It was filled with fine particles carried across continents, turning the sun hazy and painting the sky in pale, muted tones. This dust came from the land the ice left behind. When glaciers advanced, they ground the rock beneath them into powder. As the ice pulled back or stalled at its edges, the wind swept across these barren plains, lifting the finest particles into the air and driving them for hundreds, even thousands of miles. Each storm added more, spreading a blanket of dust that settled far from its source. In many regions, these layers still remain. Loess deposits, as scientists call them, stretch across China, parts of Europe and North America. They are hundreds of feet thick in some places, built up grain by grain from the winds of the Ice Age. Over time, these dusty plains would become some of the most fertile soils on Earth, but during the Ice Age itself, they were part of an unending cycle. Wind, dust, and the relentless cold. The weather that carried this dust was harsh and unpredictable. Vast temperature differences between the frozen north and the slightly warmer south drove powerful winds. These winds scoured the land, flattening snow into hard-packed sheets, and sweeping away what little warmth there was to be found. They carried not only dust but snow, piling it high in drifts that could swallow entire landscapes. Yet the Ice Age atmosphere was not only a world of wind and dust, it was a world of extremes. Winters were long and bitter, with temperatures plunging far below anything most of us could imagine. Summers, though short, could be surprisingly warm in some regions, especially on the great grasslands where the sun had little competition from clouds. This sharp contrast between seasons created an environment where life had to be endlessly adaptable, able to endure deep freezes and then burst into motion during the brief windows of growth and abundance. Volcanoes added their own chaos to this already strange sky. Massive eruptions sent ash into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and deepening the cold for years at a time. In some layers of ice cores, scientists have found traces of these ancient eruptions, fingerprints of moments when the sky itself grew darker and the glaciers seized the opportunity to press even farther. Even the very air was different. The levels of carbon dioxide during the Ice Age were far lower than they are today. The thinness of that greenhouse blanket made the atmosphere colder and drier, especially near the great ice sheets. In these regions, snow fell rarely, not because the cold prevented it, but because there was so little moisture in the air. Paradoxically, the frozen heart of the Ice Age world was often a desert of snow and wind, its surface scoured rather than buried beneath fresh flakes. For the animals that lived in this world, weather was not a passing concern. It was a force that shaped their every move. Herds of mammoth and bison followed the shifting winds to find areas where snow had been blown away, exposing the grass beneath. Predators trailed them, their survival dependent on these same patterns. Even early humans learned to read the signs in the sky, watching the winds and clouds to understand when the weather might shift and when the cold would deepen. Dust, too, carried its own consequences. While it dulled the sky and coated the ground, it also fed life. Winds dropped nutrients across the plains, scattering minerals that made the Ice Age grasslands unexpectedly rich. This strange balance, an atmosphere full of dust and wind, and yet a land that could still feed countless herds, was one of the quiet paradoxes of the Ice Age world. Imagine standing on one of those windswept plains. The horizon is wide and pale. The air is sharp, the wind never quite stopping. In the distance, a haze hangs low, a thin veil of dust stirred up by storms far away. Above it all, the sun glows weakly, its warmth reaching the ground, but never enough to chase away the bite of the air. In that moment, you could feel what it was like to live beneath an Ice Age sky. Harsh, restless, and yet strangely full of life. This atmosphere, with all its dust and sweeping winds, was not just a backdrop. It was a force that helped shape the planet and its living things. And as the air moved, it carried with it the seeds of the world that lay beneath. The grasslands that stretched from horizon to horizon and gave the Ice Age its most defining feature, the endless frozen steppe where giants roamed and survival played out on a scale as vast as the land itself. Stretching from Western Europe across Siberia and over to North America, there was a land unlike anything we see today. It was neither frozen tundra nor dense forest, but something in between. A vast, windswept grassland that supported some of the greatest gatherings of animal life in Earth's history. Scientists call it the Mammoth Steppe, and it was the beating heart of the Ice Age world. The Mammoth Steppe was enormous, larger than any single biome on Earth today. Its cold, dry air and short summers might sound harsh, but this grassland was astonishingly productive. Thick mats of tough grasses and herbs blanketed the ground, adapted perfectly to the brief season of growth. These plants did not waste energy reaching for the sky like trees. Instead, they stayed low, clinging close to the ground where the wind couldn't strip away their warmth, where they could hold fast in the thin, dusty soil left behind by the glaciers. It was this abundance of grass that allowed the giants to thrive. Herds of woolly mammoths roamed the steppe in great numbers, their tusks sweeping low as they dug through snow to reach the food beneath. Steppe bison grazed in endless lines, their heavy coats rippling in the wind. Wild horses, smaller and stockier than the ones we know today, galloped across the open plains in tightly knit herds, and mingling among them were the woolly rhinoceroses, enormous broad-shouldered animals with thick horns that they used to push through snow or defend themselves against predators bold enough to approach. The predators of the Mammoth Steppe were no less formidable. Packs of dire wolves followed the herds, their larger size and powerful jaws giving them the strength to bring down even the toughest prey. Cave lions, nearly twice the size of modern lions, hunted in coordinated groups, stalking the fringes of the grasslands. And then there were the saber-toothed cats, ambush hunters that waited for the perfect moment to strike, their curved fangs designed to pierce deep and fast. But it was not only the great beasts that lived here. Smaller creatures filled every niche. Lemmings and ground squirrels burrowed beneath the earth, their tunnels crisscrossing the frozen soil like an invisible web. Arctic foxes darted across the steppe, scavenging from kills left by the larger predators, or hunting the rodents that lived just below their feet. Even ravens and vultures circled overhead, waiting for a chance to descend when the snow was marked red by a fresh kill. And then there were the humans. They came late to this land compared to the other inhabitants, but when they arrived they became part of it. Early hunters followed the herds across the open plains, tracking mammoths and bison, learning their patterns and testing their skills against the vastness of this frozen wilderness. They built shelters from mammoth bones, covered with hides to keep out the wind, and they painted the creatures they hunted on the walls of caves, their images a record of both admiration and survival. What made the Mammoth Steppe so unique was not just its size, but its stability. For thousands of years it remained a world apart, shaped by the cold but also sheltered from it. The grasses endured the winters, lying dormant beneath the snow, only to explode back to life in the summer sun. This cycle of freezing and renewal sustained a web of life that was astonishingly resilient, even as glaciers advanced and retreated at the steppe's edges. The richness of this land can still be glimpsed today. In Siberia, frozen in the permafrost, are the remains of mammoths so well preserved that their fur still clings to their hides, their stomachs still holding the grasses they once ate. These silent relics tell us what kind of world this was, a place where life was abundant even in the shadow of the ice, where the ground was hard, the air dry, and yet there was enough to feed giants. Standing in the middle of it would have been overwhelming. The horizon would stretch in every direction, unbroken by forests or mountains. The wind would sweep across the plains, carrying the low sounds of distant herds and the calls of predators on the hunt. Every creature, from the smallest rodent to the largest mammoth, was part of a single, interwoven system, one that turned grass and dust into flesh and bone on a scale almost too large to grasp. But this world, for all its size and endurance, was not eternal. It depended on the cold to keep its balance. When the climate shifted, When the ice began to retreat and forests crept northward, the steppe began to shrink. Its great herds were pushed into smaller and smaller refuges until eventually the grassland of giants became a memory, preserved only in fossils and frozen bones. Before that day came, though, the mammoth steppe stood as one of the greatest natural stages Earth had ever known. It was here that humans honed their survival skills. It was here that the last great ice age beasts ruled. And it was here, in this cold and dusty grassland, that life learned to endure in ways that would echo long after the steppe itself was gone. From this vast plain, our journey moves toward the people who walked it, not just as wanderers, but as survivors who faced a world of ice and wind and found a way to call it home. Across the mammoth steppe and along the edges of the ice, small bands of humans moved with the seasons. They were not yet masters of this frozen world, but they were learning. In a land ruled by bitter winds and towering beasts, survival meant more than strength. It demanded knowledge, skill, and above all, the ability to adapt. Life for these early humans was shaped entirely by the cold. They built their shelters low against the wind, using whatever materials the land offered. In treeless regions where wood was scarce, they turned to the bones of mammoths. Rib bones, tusks, and skulls were stacked into frames and covered with hides, creating huts that could keep out even the harshest winter air. Inside, the space was cramped but warm, lit by the glow of a single vital force: fire. Fire was more than a tool. It was a boundary between survival and death. Around its light, families gathered close, their furs pulled tight, their hands outstretched toward the warmth. It cooked their food, hardened their weapons, and gave them protection against the endless dark of Ice Age nights. A single flame could mean safety in a world where the cold waited just beyond the walls, patient and unforgiving. But fire alone was not enough. Humans learned to shape stone into blades, scrapers, and spear points sharp enough to pierce the hides of mammoths and bison. They crafted tools from bone and antler, each one designed with precision born from necessity. Hunting in this world was no simple act. It required cooperation. Small groups worked together to track their prey across open ground, driving it into ambushes or toward waiting hunters armed with spears. A single successful hunt could feed many mouths, but a failed one could mean days of hunger. Even in the cold, they found ways to create. In caves and shelters scattered across Europe and Asia, they left behind paintings and carvings. Mammoths, bison, horses and reindeer line the walls, drawn with care and attention to detail that suggests deep familiarity with their subjects. These were not only decorations, they may have been a way to teach, to remember, or even to hope. Proof that even in a world where every day was a fight to endure, there was still room for something more than survival. Clothing, too, became a form of adaptation. Early humans stitched furs together with bone needles, layering garments until the cold could no longer cut through. Boots lined with grass and hide kept their feet from freezing on the icy ground. Each piece of clothing was shaped by experience, refined over generations of trial and error, until they could face the wind and snow and keep moving. The cold demanded this kind of relentless ingenuity. Every tool, every shelter, every firelit gathering was an answer to the same question. How do we live here? And slowly humans learned to thrive where the unprepared would have perished. They watched the animals, studying their migrations and the way they used the land. They followed the herds to fresh grazing grounds, drank from rivers carved by melting glaciers, and mapped the world not with ink or symbols, but with memory. In the long nights, they told stories. Around the fire, while the wind howled beyond their walls of bone and hide, voices carried through the darkness. They spoke of hunts, of dangers faced, and of the strange, immense world around them. Those stories were more than comfort. They were a way of passing down knowledge, of teaching the next generation how to survive in a land where one mistake could be fatal. Yet even in this unforgiving world, there were moments of quiet connection. a fire crackling in the darkness, a child curled against their mother, warm beneath layers of fur, the soft hum of voices blending with the sound of the wind outside. In those moments, the Ice Age was not only a test of endurance, it was also a place where humans began to shape themselves into the adaptable, resilient creatures they would one day become. They were not alone in this frozen world. Other humans, like the Neanderthals, shared the same harsh landscape for a time. They too mastered the cold, building their own shelters and hunting the same herds. Some groups may have exchanged tools or even joined together, leaving traces of interwoven lives that still echo in our DNA. In the deep past, under the pale light of an Ice Age sun, the boundaries between survival and innovation began to blur, and humanity's future was slowly written in firelight and shadow. These were not the bustling cities or great civilizations of later ages. These were small clusters of people bound by necessity, shaped by the land they walked. Every step, every choice, every spark of fire they lit in the snow was part of a slow march forward, a quiet determination to live in a world that seemed designed to push them back. And as the fires burned against the dark, the cold outside never truly relented. The ice still loomed on the horizon, the wind still carried their dust across the plains, but within those fragile circles of warmth, humans endured, and in enduring, they began to change the world in ways that would outlast the Ice Age itself. The cold would not break them, it would forge them, and in that forging they would take the first steps toward everything that came after. In the glow of their fires, with the wind pressing at the walls of their shelters, humans began to do more than endure. They learned to shape the world with their hands. Every tool they chipped from stone, every line they drew on a cave wall, was another step toward mastering the Ice Age rather than merely surviving it. Stone was their most faithful resource. From riverbeds and cliffs they gathered flint and chert, breaking them apart with deliberate strikes to create sharp, cutting edges. The first tools were simple, flakes for scraping hides or cutting meat, but over generations they became more refined. Hunters learned to craft long, narrow blades that could be fixed to spears, turning them into weapons that could bring down the largest animals of the steppe. They shaped bone and antler into barbed points and hooks, tools designed for precision rather than brute force. These weapons were more than instruments of survival. They were proof of a growing ability to think ahead, to imagine a solution before it was needed. But tools were not only for hunting. Scrapers smoothed hides into soft, workable leather for clothing. Awls pierced holes for stitching, allowing people to sew garments that fit tightly enough to block the wind. In a world where exposure could be deadly, the ability to make a well-sewn coat or pair of boots was as vital as any weapon. Alongside these practical tools came something unexpected: art. Deep inside caves, far from the reach of the sun, humans left marks that would last for tens of thousands of years. They painted mammoths, bison, and horses, their outlines traced in ochre and charcoal. Some scenes were simple, others showed entire herds, captured with such care that even today, their muscles and movements seem alive. Handprints pressed against the walls still remain, as if the people who made them were reaching across time, leaving a sign that they had been there, that they had seen this world and wanted it remembered. No one can say for certain why they did it. Perhaps these images were part of rituals, attempts to summon luck for the hunt, or honour the animals they depended on. Perhaps they were lessons for the young, a way of teaching them to recognise the shapes and movements of the creatures they would one day track. Or perhaps they were simply expressions of something deeply human, the urge to create, even when the world outside was hard and cold. Carvings too appeared during this time, small figures made from bone or ivory, some shaped like animals, others like humans. The most famous among them are the Venus figurines, rounded, stylized representations of the human form. Their purpose remains a mystery, but they speak of a mind that was not only concerned with food and shelter. These were the first sparks of imagination, proof that even in the shadow of the glaciers, humans carried within them a need to give shape to ideas. These same minds developed new ways to organise their lives. Hunters worked in coordinated groups, learning how to drive animals toward waiting spears. They tracked the movements of the herds, timing their migrations and mapping the land in memory. Around their fires they shared knowledge. How to chip stone, how to stitch hides, how to choose the safest path across a river swollen with meltwater. Nothing was written, but nothing was lost either. Each skill was passed from one generation to the next, a chain of survival stretching unbroken through the cold. Even the simple act of fire-making changed. Early humans learned not only how to keep a flame alive, but how to kindle it from nothing. With flint and pyrite, they struck sparks into dry tinder, coaxing embers until they bloomed into steady flames. Fire was no longer a lucky accident stolen from lightning or kept alive through sheer vigilance. It was theirs to make and control, and in that mastery lay the foundation of everything that followed. But it was art that revealed the truest transformation. In the flickering light of a torch, the walls of a cave became something more than bare stone. They became a stage for memory and meaning. Here, surrounded by the shapes of mammoths and bison drawn in deep red and black, people could look at their world not only as it was, but as they understood it. They were no longer just surviving in the Ice Age, they were beginning to define it. And in those quiet spaces hidden from the wind and snow, the first hints of what would one day become human culture began to take form. The tools grew sharper, the shelters stronger, the art more intricate. Piece by piece they were learning how to bend the cold to their will instead of being broken by it. Yet even as humans learned to shape their world, they remained a small part of it. Beyond the edges of their fires and caves, the land still belonged to the great predators that stalked the steppe. And if people were to hold their fragile place in this frozen wilderness, they would have to live alongside those hunters, sharing the same ground and facing the same harsh, unrelenting world. The Ice Age was not only a world of herds and hunters with spears, it was also the domain of predators, creatures forged by the cold into perfect instruments of survival. To walk the frozen plains was to live with constant awareness that danger moved in the shadows, its presence as much a part of the landscape as the snow and wind. Among the most fearsome were the saber-toothed cats. Their long, curved fangs have become symbols of the Ice Age itself, blades of bone and enamel that could pierce deep into the flesh of their prey. These cats were not built for long chases. Their legs were powerful but short, their bodies stocky, their strength concentrated in the shoulders and neck. They were ambush predators, lurking in the low shrubs or along the edges of river valleys, until an unsuspecting bison or young mammoth strayed too close. When they struck, it was fast and brutal, their fangs driving home before the prey even had time to run. Yet the saber-tooths were not the only hunters to fear. Cave lions, nearly twice the size of modern lions, prowled the mammoth steppe. Unlike the solitary saber-tooth, these great cats likely hunted in groups, their cooperation giving them an advantage over even the largest prey. Imagine a pack of them fanning out across the snow, their golden coats blending into the pale light, their paws moving silently over the frozen ground. Few animals could withstand a coordinated attack from predators of such size and strength. Then there were the dire wolves. Heavier and more powerful than the wolves we know today, they roamed in packs, their numbers turning them into one of the deadliest forces of the Ice Age. They followed the herds for miles, wearing down their prey until exhaustion delivered the kill. For humans, these wolves were both rivals and warnings. The sound of their howls rolling across the steppe was a reminder that in this frozen world, hunters were never truly safe. Even the smaller predators held their own place in the hierarchy of fear. The wolverine, fierce and relentless, was a scavenger that could drive away animals many times its size. Foxes darted at the edges of hunts, stealing scraps whenever they could. Raptors circled overhead, waiting for the chance to descend upon the remains left behind by the great hunters of the ice. humans did not exist outside this chain. They were part of it. When they ventured out from their shelters to hunt or scavenge, they risked crossing paths with these predators. A single misstep could turn the hunter into prey. This constant pressure forced people to be cautious, to travel in groups, to keep their fires burning bright at night as both warmth and warning. The glow of a campfire was a fragile barrier against the dark, but it was enough to hold the shadows at bay. The relationship between humans and predators was not only one of fear, it was also one of competition and respect. When early hunters tracked a herd of bison, they sometimes found themselves following the same trail as a pack of dire wolves. When they scavenged the remains of a mammoth, they might arrive to find a saber-tooth already feeding. In these moments, survival was not only about strength, but about nerve, about knowing when to fight, when to retreat, and when to wait for the larger predator to finish and move on. Yet, in time, humans found ways to tip the balance. Spears gave them reach. Fire gave them a weapon that even the boldest predators hesitated to challenge. Slowly, they became more than prey that fought back. They became rivals that could not be ignored. Still, this was not dominance. It was a truce of necessity, an uneasy coexistence on the vast open steppe where every living thing fought for the same few precious calories of meat and fat. Predators shaped the behaviour of humans just as much as they shaped the herds. The need to watch, to stay alert, to plan every movement became part of life itself. And perhaps, in the presence of saber-tooths and cave lions, humans learned something else: the value of cooperation. Alone, a person was vulnerable. Together around their fires, armed with their tools and their voices, they stood a chance. The Ice Age was a world that never allowed anyone, beast or human, to forget what lurked beyond the reach of the firelight. The predators of the permafrost were a constant reminder that survival was never guaranteed, and yet it was in this dangerous world that humans sharpened not only their spears but their minds, becoming more than just one more animal moving across the steppe. As the great hunters prowled the snow and the winds swept over the frozen plains, the stage was set for a struggle that would shape the very fate of the giants that ruled this land, a struggle that would decide which species would endure and which would fade into the long memory of the Ice Age. The Ice Age was a world of scale. Everywhere you turned there was something larger, stranger, or more formidable than anything that walks the earth today. It wasn't only the mammoths or the saber-tooths. Across the continents, in every habitat shaped by the cold and wind, there were creatures that seemed almost mythical, a reminder that this was a wilder planet than the one we know now. On the open grasslands, the mammoth herds were only the beginning. Beside them roamed the woolly rhinoceroses, broad-shouldered and cloaked in dense fur, their long horns sweeping forward like natural spears. These animals were powerful enough to defend themselves against nearly any predator, and yet they shared the steppe with bison that stood taller than a man, wild horses with thick, stocky frames, and musk oxen built to survive the unrelenting cold. Farther south, where the ice gave way to open forests and temperate plains, other giants ruled. Mastodons wandered among the trees, stripping bark from trunks with their long, flexible trunks. They were distant relatives of the mammoth, smaller but no less imposing. Ground sloths the size of small cars lumbered through the Americas, their massive claws digging into roots and tearing branches down from above. And in the same lands where these slow-moving herbivores roamed, predators followed. The short-faced bear, towering over any living bear today, stalked across the grasslands of North America. Its long legs carried it at speeds that would surprise any creature unfortunate enough to draw its attention. In Australia, the world was no less strange. There, giant kangaroos with powerful limbs shared the land with marsupial lions, predators unlike anything else on Earth. Enormous flightless birds heavier than ostriches stalked the open country, while reptiles far larger than their modern descendants lingered in rivers and swamps. their armoured bodies and crushing jaws unchanged since deep time. Even the oceans carried their share of Ice Age wonders. Along the coasts, sea levels had fallen, exposing new hunting grounds for early humans and the predators of the sea alike. Marine mammals like the enormous Steller's sea cow, a relative of the manatee, grazed on underwater meadows of kelp, while fearsome sharks still prowled the deeper waters. Life in the Ice Age was not simply land-bound, it was a global network of giants. What made this world even more extraordinary was the sheer density of these animals. The mammoth steppe and the surrounding regions were among the most productive ecosystems the planet has ever seen, supporting vast numbers of herbivores and the predators that followed them. Food was never abundant by modern standards, but the cold, dry conditions produced grasslands that stretched nearly unbroken across continents, creating an unending stage for herds to roam and hunters to stalk. Humans lived among these creatures in a kind of precarious balance. To hunt a mammoth or a bison was to risk everything, but the rewards were too great to ignore. A single successful hunt could feed an entire band and provide bone and hide for tools and shelter. Yet there was also danger in sharing the land with predators that could challenge humans for their kills, or for their lives. To survive in this world of megafauna, humans became observers as much as hunters. They learned the habits of every creature they encountered, the way bison gathered before a storm, the trails mammoths followed to reach the best grazing grounds, the patterns of predators shadowing the herds. Each scrap of knowledge could mean the difference between life and death. And yet, for all its danger, this was a world of astonishing richness. Imagine standing on a ridge above the Ice Age plains. Before you stretches an ocean of grass and movement, mammoths pushing through the snow, bison kicking up clouds of frost, horses stamping and snorting in the cold air. In the distance you see the dark shapes of predators, following the herds with patient determination. Overhead, vultures circle, their sharp eyes fixed on the drama below. Everywhere, the world is alive, immense and untamed. But this abundance was fragile. It was held together by the cold, by the vast reach of the glaciers and the steppe that surrounded them. As the climate shifted and the ice began to retreat, this world of giants would change. Forests would reclaim the plains, rivers would swell and redraw the land, and the creatures that once ruled the Ice Age would face a challenge they could not overcome. Before that change came, though, this wilder earth thrived. It was here, in the age of mammoths and saber-tooths and towering sloths, that humans sharpened their tools, their wits, and their determination. They did not merely live in the shadow of giants, they learned from them. And soon, as the ice began its long retreat, the relationship between humans and these massive creatures would shift in ways that would alter the course of the Ice Age forever. The Ice Age did not end with a single thaw. It was not a sudden collapse of cold or an overnight vanishing of the glaciers. Instead, it was a long, uneven retreat, a slow unravelling of the frozen grip that had held the world for tens of thousands of years. The Earth shifted in small increments, and each change carried consequences that reshaped the land, the seas, and the lives that depended on them. It began with warmth so subtle that it might have gone unnoticed. Summers grew slightly longer, and the snows that once lingered deep into the year began to melt more completely. The glaciers, those immense rivers of ice, felt the difference first. Their edges softened. Meltwater trickled across their surfaces, carving channels that grew wider and deeper with each passing season. What had once been silent and still now began to move with a new kind of urgency. These early meltwaters cut through the land like knives. Glacial rivers burst forth from beneath the ice, carrying silt and stone in their torrents, reshaping valleys and carving out new channels. Lakes formed where the ice blocked their path, only to drain in sudden, catastrophic floods when those icy barriers finally gave way. Each flood tore across the land with an unstoppable force, leaving behind scars that would last for ages. As the glaciers withdrew, they revealed ground that had not seen sunlight in thousands of years. This raw land was barren at first, scraped clean by the grinding weight of the ice, but life wasted no time in reclaiming it. Mosses and lichens crept in first, clinging to the exposed rock. Then came the grasses, their roots sinking into the fresh soil carried by the winds. Slowly the barren ground transformed into new ecosystems, green threads woven across the grey scars of the retreating ice. The animals followed. Herds of bison and mammoth moved into the freshly uncovered plains, grazing on the new growth. Predators shadowed them, filling the same ancient roles but now in a changing landscape. Humans too pressed forward. They tracked the rivers, hunted along the edges of the shrinking glaciers, and stepped into regions that had been buried in ice for generations. But the retreat of the glaciers was not steady. There were pauses, even reversals. Periods of warming were followed by sharp, sudden returns of the cold. Moments when the ice surged forward once more, reclaiming the ground it had lost. These were brief compared to the long sweep of the Ice Age, but for the people and animals living through them, they were reminders that the Earth's great thaw was far from simple. One of the most dramatic of these reversals came in what we now call the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions roughly 12,000 years ago. Just as the world seemed to be warming for good, the cold came rushing back, halting the retreat of the glaciers and plunging much of the planet into a final, unexpected freeze. For over 1,000 years the advance of spring was delayed, the grasslands withered, and survival became once again a matter of endurance. And yet, even that last gasp of the Ice Age eventually gave way. When the cold finally loosened its grip for good, the glaciers retreated faster than ever. The seas, fed by the meltwater of 1,000 rivers, began to rise. Lowlands vanished beneath the waves. Land bridges that had once carried humans and animals across continents were swallowed by the ocean. Beringia, the vast tundra that had linked Asia to North America, slipped beneath the waters of the Bering Strait. Doggerland, once a rich hunting ground between Britain and mainland Europe, was drowned by the rising North Sea. As the world warmed, forests began to creep northward, replacing the great grasslands of the Mammoth Steppe. Trees spread across Europe, Asia and North America, transforming open plains into shadowed woodlands. Many of the Ice Age giants, creatures built for a world of cold and endless space, found themselves hemmed in by this changing landscape. Some adapted, many did not. For humans, this transformation was an opportunity. As the glaciers retreated and the climate stabilized, they discovered lands rich in rivers, fertile soil and new resources. They followed the meltwaters, settled near the lakes and valleys carved by the ice, and began the long process of turning from wandering hunters into something different, the first settlers of a warming world. Yet even as they adapted to this new Earth, the glaciers remained a memory carved into the land. Their valleys became highways for rivers. Their deposits of silt and stone became the foundations of future farmlands. Their retreat marked not only the end of an age of cold, but the beginning of the world that would follow. The Ice Age was not over yet, but its strength was broken. The walls of ice that had once seemed eternal were fading, and in their place, new landscapes were emerging. The last great floods were still to come, and with them the final transformation of the planet. As the glaciers weakened and the world warmed, the ice did not simply vanish. It fought its way out, melting in fits and starts, sometimes quietly, sometimes in catastrophic bursts. Beneath and within the shrinking sheets of ice, water gathered in vast hidden reservoirs, held back by walls of frozen mass that had stood for thousands of years. When those walls failed, the earth itself seemed to roar. These were not ordinary floods. They were torrents so immense that they rewrote the land in a matter of days. In North America, one of the greatest examples of this lay beneath the Laurentide ice sheet. As it melted, a massive body of water known as Glacial Lake Agassiz formed, larger than all of the Great Lakes combined. For centuries it remained trapped behind walls of ice and land. But ice is not permanent. When its barriers gave way, the lake exploded outward in a flood that would have been beyond anything the human eye could easily comprehend. Water surged across the land with unstoppable force. Entire valleys drowned in hours. Rivers that had been small and meandering were transformed into raging torrents miles wide. These floods carried boulders as easily as twigs, grinding the earth and scouring deep channels into the bedrock. They poured toward the oceans, raising sea levels, and in doing so they altered the climate itself. Each flood was like a jolt to the planet's system, reshaping wind patterns and redistributing heat across the globe. This was not an isolated event. Around the edges of the melting glaciers, other hidden lakes lay waiting. Some broke free in violent bursts, sending walls of water crashing over the landscape. Others drained more slowly, their outflows carving new rivers that still exist today. The Columbia River Gorge in the Pacific Northwest, for instance, was partly shaped by a series of these glacial outbursts, floods so massive that they tore through the land again and again, leaving behind a landscape of cliffs and canyons as if carved by an ancient giant's hand. In Europe, similar forces were at work. As the ice withdrew, meltwater pooled in basins, forming lakes that eventually overflowed, changing the course of rivers and cutting new paths through the land. Even in Siberia, vast glacial lakes once covered what are now dry plains, their waters locked in place by walls of ice until they too broke and spilled away. For the humans who lived in this shifting world, these floods must have been both terrifying and transformative. Camps and hunting grounds near the shores of these lakes would have been swept away in an instant. Valleys that once teemed with game would vanish beneath rushing water. Yet in their wake, these floods also left behind new landscapes, fertile plains, and waterways that would become lifelines for the generations that followed. Even the lakes that never burst played a role in reshaping the planet. Some remained trapped in the land for centuries after the glaciers retreated, their waters collecting in the deep scars carved by ice. Many of the Great Lakes we know today, Superior, Michigan, Huron, are the remnants of this time, their basins filled by meltwater as the last of the ice vanished. These lakes became more than just geological features. They were reservoirs of life, feeding the rivers and nourishing the plants and animals that would reclaim the once frozen world. But not all these lakes were permanent. Some were ghosts of the Ice Age, vanishing as quickly as they appeared, their waters draining away once the ice that held them back was gone. Others shrank into smaller forms, their massive shorelines left behind like faded memories etched into the earth. To the people of the time, these changes must have felt as if the world itself was shifting under their feet. One generation might grow up beside a vast lake, its distant shores barely visible. The next might find that same lake gone, replaced by open grassland or a new river running where none had been before. In the span of human memory, the land was alive, changing in ways that demanded constant adaptation. These floods and hidden lakes were not only endings, they were beginnings. They carried away the last remnants of the glacial world and carved out the landscapes of the present. They created the river valleys where future civilizations would one day rise. They left behind fertile plains enriched with the sediments of a vanished age, and in their rush and their silence, they marked the final struggles of the Ice Age as it yielded to a warmer, greener Earth. But even as the waters reshaped the land, another story was unfolding. The fate of the giants that had ruled this frozen world for so long. The Ice Age was melting away, and with it, many of the creatures that had defined it would soon follow. As the glaciers retreated and the world warmed, the great animals of the Ice Age faced a challenge they could not overcome. For tens of thousands of years, mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats had dominated their frozen world. They had adapted perfectly to a life built on cold winds and endless grasslands. But the Ice Age was ending, and with it, the very foundation of their survival began to crumble. The first blow came from the changing climate. As the ice sheets melted, the mammoth steppe, the vast dry grassland that had supported herds of enormous grazers, began to shrink. In its place, forests crept northward, their trees closing in on land that had once been open and boundless. For creatures built for the plains, this new world was suffocating. The grasses that had fed them disappeared beneath canopies of leaves, replaced by plants they were poorly suited to eat. Mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses could move only so far before the forests blocked their way. Steppe bison and wild horses, once able to roam across continents, found their ranges cut into fragments. The predators that depended on these great herds, dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, and cave lions, saw their food supplies dwindle. Bit by bit, the intricate web of Ice Age life began to unravel. But climate alone was not the only force pressing on these giants. At the same time, humans were spreading into every corner of their world. With tools sharpened over thousands of years and the knowledge passed down through generations, hunters had become formidable. A single band of skilled humans armed with spears could bring down a mammoth. What once had been a rare and dangerous feat became more frequent, especially as populations grew and hunting methods became more sophisticated. Some researchers argue that it was not simply hunting that doomed the giants, but the combination of hunting and a warming climate. The great animals were already under pressure from shrinking habitats and dwindling food. When humans arrived, they pushed the balance past its breaking point. The evidence lies scattered across the earth. In Siberia, frozen mammoths lie buried in the permafrost, some with wounds that could only have come from human weapons. In North America, mammoth kill sites show clear signs of organised hunts, with bones cracked open for marrow and meat stripped clean. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger pattern, one that played out wherever humans and megafauna met. And yet, even as many of these giants disappeared, some clung to survival. On a remote Arctic island called Wrangel, a small population of mammoths survived for thousands of years after their kin vanished from the mainland. They dwindled in size, becoming smaller, weaker versions of their ancestors, but they endured, cut off from the rest of the world by rising seas. Eventually even they disappeared, but their long survival stands as a final echo of a vanished age. The extinction was not swift. It happened in waves, beginning in some regions while the giants still roamed in others. In Australia, many of the great marsupial beasts were gone long before the northern ice sheets had even begun to melt. In the Americas, mammoths and saber-tooths held on, until the warming world and the spread of humans reached a tipping point. By the time the Ice Age finally yielded to the present climate, the great herds had thinned to nothing, leaving behind only bones and silence. This extinction winter reshaped the Earth as much as the melting glaciers. With the loss of the giants, entire ecosystems shifted. The grasslands that had once been kept open by herds of mammoths and bison gave way more quickly to forests. Predators that had relied on large prey either vanished or adapted to smaller targets. And humans, no longer sharing the land with towering beasts, found themselves in a quieter, emptier world. Still, traces of that wild age remain. The muskox survives in the Arctic tundra, a living fragment of the steppe. Bison still roam in smaller herds, their ancestors having endured when so many others failed. Even the elephants of today carry echoes of the mammoths in their blood. But the giants who once defined the Ice Age exist now only in frozen remains, in scattered fossils, and in the faint memory of what the Earth once was. Their disappearance was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new one. With the glaciers gone and the great beasts fading, the world shifted once more, setting the stage for the rise of a planet that looked more and more like the one we now call home. When the last of the great beasts faded and the glaciers withdrew for the final time, the world began to change in ways that would have been unrecognizable to those who had lived through the height of the Ice Age. What had once been a frozen, windswept planet of ice and dust began to soften. The sharp edges carved by the glaciers gave way to gentler forms. Rivers swelled, forests advanced, and the earth began a slow transformation from white to green. The warming was not sudden, but its effects were everywhere. Vast sheets of ice that had dominated the northern continents for tens of thousands of years shrank back toward the poles. In their absence, valleys opened, plains stretched wide, and the scars left by the retreating glaciers filled with meltwater. These new lakes became anchors for life, their shores lined with the first green shoots of plants reclaiming the land. The grasses that had once stretched endlessly across the mammoth steppe began to give way to forests. Birch and pine came first, hardy pioneers able to grow in poor soil and cold conditions. Then came oak, elm, and other broadleaf trees, spreading northward as the climate stabilized. Within a few thousand years, regions that had once been treeless plains were transformed into dense woodlands. The open horizon of the Ice Age was replaced by a canopy of green. With the forest came new animals. Deer moved into the newly shaded lands, followed by wild boar and smaller grazers that thrived among the trees. Wolves, once hunters of the great herds, adapted to the forest, becoming stealthier and more specialized. Even humans changed with the land. No longer following the vast migrations of mammoths or bison, they learned to hunt the more elusive creatures of the woods, crafting bows and arrows to strike from a distance, and creating tools suited not to the steppe, but to the shaded world beneath the leaves. The rivers born from the melting ice carried nutrients into the lowlands, turning many of these regions into fertile corridors of life. Fish filled the streams and birds nested along the water's edge. Wetlands formed in the hollows left by retreating glaciers, attracting an explosion of life. Where once there had been a landscape of scarcity, there was now abundance. Even the oceans changed. As the glaciers released their water back into the seas, shorelines shifted inward. Coastal plains vanished beneath the waves, but in their place, new bays and estuaries were formed, teeming with marine life. Where the sea met the land, humans found some of their richest hunting grounds, gathering shellfish and fish along the coasts, and adapting once again to a changing world. But this transformation was not only physical, it reshaped the rhythm of life itself. The Ice Age had been a world of extremes, with its endless winters and brief frantic summers. Now, as the climate warmed, the seasons became more balanced. Spring stretched longer, summers grew milder, winters softened. The world was no less demanding, but its pace was gentler, its opportunities broader. This shift opened the door to something entirely new. For the first time, humans began to stay in one place for longer periods. They gathered plants, hunted smaller game, and learned to read the cycles of the changing environment. Slowly, tentatively, they began to shape the land, clearing patches of forest, scattering seeds, and setting the first stones of a future where they would no longer only follow what nature gave, but begin to mould it themselves. The rebirth of the planet was not merely the end of the Ice Age, it was the foundation of the world we know. The forests that spread across Europe and Asia, the grasslands that remained in North America, the swelling rivers and new lakes, all of these became the backdrop for the rise of human society. From these green landscapes would come the first farms, the first villages, and eventually the first cities. Yet even in this greener earth, reminders of the Ice Age lingered. The Great Lakes carved by glaciers still dotted the continents. The wind still carried dust from the places where the ice had once ground rock into powder. In the far north, tundra and ice still clung to the edges of the world, a pale echo of the age that had passed. The planet had not simply recovered from the Ice Age, it had been remade by it. Every valley and river, every fertile plain, every forest that spread in the wake of the retreating glaciers was a legacy of that frozen era. from the scars of the ice came a world ready for something new, and humanity, no longer just a species of hunters on the steppe, was about to take its next step forward. But even as green spread over the land, the memory of the Ice Age did not fade. Its marks were written deep into the stones and soils of the earth, waiting for those who would one day learn how to read them. Even after the last of the great glaciers retreated and the world grew green, the Ice Age never truly vanished. Its traces remain all around us, etched into the surface of the earth and hidden deep within its layers. Every valley carved by ice, every boulder stranded far from its birthplace, and every band of sediment locked in stone is a quiet reminder of a world that once lay frozen beneath an endless sky of snow and wind. The most striking of these traces are the landforms themselves. Across North America and Europe, U-shaped valleys bear the unmistakable signature of glaciers. Unlike rivers, which carve narrow channels with winding paths, ice scours everything in its way, leaving behind broad, deep valleys with sheer walls and flat bottoms. These landscapes are the shadows of the ancient ice sheets, silent but undeniable proof of their slow, grinding power. Scattered across the plains, solitary boulders tell another part of the story. These glacial erratics, some as large as houses, were carried for hundreds of miles within the ice and left behind when the glaciers melted. They rest where no mountain could have formed them, standing like monuments to journeys that ended thousands of years before the first human cities were built. Lakes too are relics of the frozen past. The Great Lakes, the Finger Lakes, and countless smaller ones across the northern hemisphere were carved by the weight of the glaciers. When the ice withdrew, these deep scars filled with meltwater, becoming the freshwater giants we know today. Every ripple of their surfaces is a remnant of an age when the world was locked in ice. But the most delicate whispers of the Ice Age are hidden in places we cannot see. Beneath Greenland and Antarctica, ancient layers of ice hold air bubbles trapped for hundreds of thousands of years. Scientists drill deep into these frozen archives, retrieving cores that read like the pages of a history book. Each layer preserves a moment in time, recording the atmosphere, the temperature, even the dust carried by long-vanished winds. From these frozen records, we have learned how the Ice Age began, how it breathed in cycles of cold and warmth, and how it finally loosened its grip. In the rocks beneath our feet there are other traces. Loess plains, vast deposits of wind-blown dust left behind during the Ice Age, stretch across China, Europe, and North America. These layers of fine, pale soil were carried by Ice Age winds and dropped in thick blankets that still feed the farmlands of today. Every harvest that grows from these soils is a quiet legacy of the glaciers that once scoured the land bare. Even the bones of the Ice Age remain, pulled from frozen ground and deep caves where they have slept for millennia. Perfectly preserved mammoths, their hair still intact, emerge from the Siberian permafrost. In North America, the bones of mastodons and giant sloths lie buried beneath peat bogs. In Europe, the skulls of cave lions and dire wolves rest in caverns once lit by the fires of early humans. These remains are not just fossils, they are direct connections to a world where cold and survival shaped everything. The stories written in stone and ice are not just about the past. They are a reminder of how deeply the Ice Age shaped the world we live in now. The fertile soils, the river valleys, the coastlines, all of these were sculpted in that frozen era. Even the distribution of plants and animals across the continents was set in motion by the slow advance and retreat of the glaciers. To walk through these places today is to stand in the footprint of that vanished world. A hiker tracing the rim of a glacial valley, a farmer turning the rich dust of an ancient Loess plain, or a scientist holding a shard of mammoth tusk. All of them are touching the same story, a story written not in words but in stone, water, and bone. Yet these traces are not only silent reminders of what once was, they are clues, pieces of a puzzle that we are still putting together. Each valley mapped, each core of ice drilled, and each fossil uncovered deepens our understanding not only of the Ice Age, but of the forces that still shape our planet today. And as we follow those whispers through stone and ice, we find that the past is not gone. It lives beneath our feet, hidden in the landscapes we see every day. The Ice Age may have ended thousands of years ago, but its fingerprints are still everywhere. Every time we look at a map, every time we step outside and see the shape of a valley, the course of a river, or the outline of a coastline, we are looking at the legacy of that frozen past. The world we live in is not separate from the Ice Age. It is the world the Ice Age left behind. The most obvious echoes are in the land itself. The Great Lakes, carved out by the grinding weight of glaciers, still hold a fifth of the planet's fresh water. The smooth hills of New England and the plains of northern Europe are draped in glacial sediments, their soils made fertile by the dust and rock left behind as the ice retreated. Even the winding courses of many modern rivers were first traced by the torrents of meltwater that poured from the glaciers at the end of the Ice Age. In the far north, the Ice Age is not just history, it is still present. The tundra of Siberia, Alaska and northern Canada remains frozen for much of the year, its permafrost locking away the remains of a world that once was. In that frozen ground, the bones of mammoths still emerge, along with traces of plants and even bacteria that have slept since the coldest days of the Pleistocene. Our atmosphere, too, still carries the marks of the Ice Age. The levels of carbon dioxide and the rhythms of Earth's climate were shaped in part by those frozen cycles. The patterns of ocean currents and wind, the very systems that carry storms and rains across the planet, were influenced by the way the glaciers sculpted the continents and shifted the weight of the Earth's crust. Even today, the planet still readjusts from the immense burden of ice that once pressed it down, the land rising millimetre by millimetre in a slow rebound that began thousands of years ago and has yet to finish. The legacy of the Ice Age is written in the lives of animals as well. Bison still roam the plains of North America, descendants of herds that grazed alongside mammoths. Musk oxen, shaggy and unyielding, remain on the Arctic tundra, unchanged from their Ice Age ancestors. The reindeer and caribou that migrate across the north each year are following paths carved not only by instinct, but by a memory older than human history, one rooted in the age of ice and wind. Even within us, the echoes remain. The migrations of our ancestors were guided by the world of the Ice Age. Humans crossed land bridges exposed by low seas, followed the herds across the mammoth steppe, and learned to survive in cold that would have killed the unprepared. The skills forged in that time, fire, tools, cooperation, didn't fade with the melting ice. They became the foundations of everything that followed, in the landscapes we farm, in the roots of our rivers and the shape of our coastlines, in the animals that still walk the tundra, and in the bones buried beneath our feet. The Ice Age is never far away. It shaped the Earth, and, in many ways, it shaped us. But perhaps the most striking echo of all is this. The Ice Age reminds us how quickly the world can change. Entire ecosystems came and went. Seas rose and fell. Giants walked the earth and vanished forever. And through it all, life adapted. It survived. It found new ways forward. The frozen world may be gone, but its story is not over. It continues in the ground beneath us, in the fossils we uncover, and in the landscapes that stretch around us. The Ice Age is not just a chapter of the past, it is the prologue of the present. And as we turn from these echoes toward the world we know now, we can finally step back and look at the full sweep of that frozen age, from its first creeping cold to its last lingering traces. If you could walk back into the Ice Age now, step by step, past the forests and rivers of the present and into that frozen world, the first thing you would notice would be the quiet. The wind would still move, and the snow would still fall, but there would be a deep stillness beneath it all, the kind that only comes when time itself seems to stretch wider than you can imagine. You would see the horizon open into vast plains, where the sky feels larger than the earth below it. You'd watch herds of mammoths moving slowly across the steppe, their breath rising in clouds against the pale air. In the distance, bison would graze in lines that seemed to go on forever, and far beyond them, the faint shapes of predators would follow, silent and patient. The cold would bite at your skin, but the world itself would feel alive in a way that is hard to find today. A world of raw, unfiltered scale. You might stop by the edge of a glacier, its wall rising like a frozen cliff, blue ice gleaming where the sunlight strikes it. Water would trickle down its face in thin streams, the beginning of rivers that would one day carve their way across entire continents. The sound of it would be low and steady, a reminder that even the mightiest walls of ice are never truly still. They breathe, they shift, and eventually they let go. And then, if you turned away from the ice and walked into the lowlands, you'd find traces of human life. A small circle of huts built from bone and hide, smoke rising from a fire at the centre. You'd see footprints in the snow, tools laid out for sharpening, and hunters returning from the horizon, their faces marked by wind and sun. These people would look at the same frozen land not with wonder, but with familiarity. For them, this was not a distant past. It was home. To walk through this world would be to see the earth in one of its most honest forms. No cities, no roads, no walls, only the slow, patient work of nature, carving and shaping everything over millennia. The Ice Age was not a frozen prison. It was a teacher, a sculptor, and in its own way, a beginning. And even though it is gone, its presence has never truly left. It lingers in the valleys and lakes carved by its glaciers, in the soil that feeds our crops, in the animals that still roam the coldest edges of the planet. It lives in our own history, in the fires our ancestors built and the tools they carried across the endless snow. If you stand outside on a winter's night, when the air is sharp and the world is still, you can almost feel it. A memory that isn't yours, written in the stones beneath your feet, carried in the wind, whispered by the quiet weight of time itself. The Ice Age is not just something we left behind, it is something that shaped the ground we walk on and the lives we live. Its story is written into the world, and if you listen closely enough, it is still there, faint but steady, like footsteps in ancient snow. And so, as we leave this frozen world behind, we carry it with us. Every glacier, every herd, every firelit camp of our ancestors has led to this moment. The Ice Age is gone, but its story remains etched into the earth and into us. When you look at the land, the rivers, the hills, the quiet stretch of sky, you're seeing its legacy. When you feel the chill of winter wind, you're touching something ancient, a faint echo of a world where survival was the only language and the snow never truly stopped falling. We walk now in a different age, one of warmth and change, but we're shaped by the one that came before. And perhaps in knowing that, we can better see our place in the story, not as separate from it, but as its continuation. The Ice Age never truly ends. It lingers in stone, in water, in memory. And in the quiet, if you pause long enough to listen, it is still there, waiting,